And I want to start today, we've been talking a lot about technology at this conference, and I want to take a step back, and we're going to focus on technology, but also the content and the storytelling that needs to go into it. And I want to start with the story of Doug Dietz, if my clicker would work, which it's not, so I'll use my computer, with the story of Doug Dietz. So Doug Dietz was one of GE's best product designers, and a few years ago, he was tasked with reimagining the MRI machine for GE and bringing it into the 21st century. Because MRI machines up until then had been these big, clunky, boxy machines, and Dietz spent years and tens of millions of dollars to design this new state-of-the-art machine. It was sleek, had this sort of donut-shaped hole you went into. It looked like it belonged in Star Wars or in Star Trek, and he was so proud of it. And when it became time to start using it, he went to the hospital because he wanted to see his invention in action. But what he saw made him want to cry. What Dietz saw, okay, it's still not working. What Dietz saw was that there's children, particularly this little girl, who is being dragged towards the MRI machine, screaming, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, don't make me go again. I don't want to go in that machine again." And Dietz was crestfallen. Because what he realized, what he hadn't thought about when he was designing the product, is that an MRI is really, really scary for a little kid. You have to lay on this cold, flat board. You get a needle stuck into your arm. And you're told very sternly that you can't move while you're in there for a half an hour, or else we're going to have to do this whole thing all over again. So Dietz didn't know what to do, because these were the people that he wanted to help the most. He wanted to help these sick kids. And the machine that he invented, that he was so proud of, this amazing product, was terrifying to them, traumatizing. And so Dietz went to a design workshop. And there he got an idea. And he thought, it's going to be way too expensive, unfeasible to redesign this machine. But what if the night before a child went to get an MRI, her mom read her a storybook about a pirate adventure that she'd go on the next day? And on this pirate adventure, she would meet lots of new friends, like Marcella the monkey and Tina the toucan. And when she got to the hospital, all of the doctors and nurses would be in role play too, and they'd bring her along on this storybook adventure. And so they decided to try it out. Little girl came to the hospital, and she was told to lie really still on the submarine that was going to drift into the Pirate's Cove. And once she get in there, all of her friends, Tina the toucan and Marcella the monkey, would be in there. And you know what happened? Instead of that little girl crying, don't make me go there again, don't make me go in that machine again, she started crying, "Can I go again?" And I love this story because it illustrates the incredible power that stories have in our lives. As humans, we are programmed for stories. Stories are a part of who we are as people. They're how we pass on information when we were around campfires before we had language. It's how we told ourselves, sorry, I'm a little bit sick. It's how we told ourselves how to find food, how to stay out of danger. It's how we told ourselves how to take care of each other, to build societies and bonds. There's this amazing story and book called The Storytelling Animal by Jonathan Gottschall. And it's about how we've evolved with storytelling as human beings. And there's this one quote in it that I absolutely love, that we as a species are addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. And if you think about it, this is true. When we're children, we're immersed in a world of story, in a world of play, constantly. As human beings, even if you've been at this conference for a day and a half, I bet there's been dozens, maybe hundreds of moments where it seemed like you were paying attention, but you were drifting off into daydreams, stories of your lives that you're telling yourself. It's so ingrained in our day-to-day lives, this programming of stories in us, that we don't even notice it anymore. And you don't have to just take my word for it or Gottschall's word for it. Neuroscientists have proved this as well. So over the last 10 years, there's been more neuroscience research done than in all of history up until then. And a lot of that research is actually focused on content and storytelling. A big reason for this is that DARPA, which is a semi-secret agency inside of the DoD, about 9 years ago started funding a lot of research into the neurological response that people have to different types of content and different types of stories, because they wanted to figure out how terrorist groups and ISIS were recruiting people in the Middle East. They wanted to understand what sort of communications on the American side would allow us to get people to cooperate with us. So they started funding a lot of these academic neuroscience research to help figure out what sort of content, what sort of stories, what sort of communication are most impactful. And this one neuroscientist I work with a lot and talk to a lot, Dr. Paul Zak in Emergent Neuroscience, he was one of the first groups to be funded by the DoD, continues to be today. And they found something really interesting because they were studying a neurochemical called oxytocin. So about 10 years ago, all we really knew about oxytocin is that it was this neurochemical that would be produced when mothers were with their children. And Dr. Zak's group was looking at other situations in which oxytocin is produced, when we're with friends or when we're with families. But then Dr. Zak got an idea, which is to start looking at oxytocin production in other areas, such as when we're consuming media, when we're hearing different types of stories. And what he found is that same amazing neurochemical that sparks feelings of empathy and connection, when we have higher levels of oxytocin, we're more likely to give to charity, to feel connected to the person or thing we're hearing a story about or being told a story from, that this magical neurochemical is produced when we hear a really great story. Neuroscientists have found other things about stories in the brain. They've also found that when we hear a great story, the neural activity in our brain increases fivefold. So most back-of-the-envelope, simple neuroscience lesson ever. Our brain runs on a series of electric pulses. And when we hear a really good story, that neural activity increases fivefold. Stories illuminate the city of our mind. It's like someone's just flipped on a switchboard. And neuroscientists have this saying, which is that neurons that fire together wire together. So the really cool thing is that the reason we retain more information when we hear it through a story is because we have all those neurons firing, and they're wiring together and creating neural pathways that leads us to remember more things. So stories do something really, really amazing as a result. Because all that oxytocin they're producing, stories make us care. Because of the neural activity, stories make us remember. And I think that is at the essence of what content marketing is, right? It's the fact that stories make us remember and stories make us care, which just happens to be what all brands want. And there's a lot of really interesting technology coming out in this arena, one of which is these immersion bands that Emergent Neuroscience is creating. Actually, I have one right here. So what it does is it straps onto your forearm like this, and it measures two things. It measures oxytocin production through the vagus nerve, and it deciphers different heart rate signals, different indicators through a machine learning algorithm they've tested over the last 10 years to figure out how much attention we're paying. And these two things combine to signal immersion. So they're able to track in real time how immersed we are in a piece of content that we're consuming. And the really cool thing when we talk about connecting engagement and immersion in stories and brand content to purchase actions is they've actually been able to predict the likelihood that someone will purchase something afterwards with an 83% accuracy based on their immersion levels. So if we're really immersed in a story, they were then able to predict whether they would buy something or not. So that's the next really cool thing that stories do, is stories make our brains want to buy. And this really is what it comes down to. Content marketing works. We're here, we're talking about all of this. We're trying to figure out all the different technology to get our content programs and our content production right, because our brains are programmed for stories. That's why it matters in the first place to the consumers we're trying to reach. But then we always get to this question of how do you tell stories that break through? When it feels like we're yelling into a hurricane of sound every single day, when it feels like we're competing with the millions of stories our consumers, our audience, our buyers have in their pockets at every moment, have this question of how do you break through? Well, neuroscience researchers have found 4 common elements to stories that have high immersion rates. The first is relatability. So this is the sense that I can relate to the character that I'm hearing this story about. Now, this can be something like in the GE example for a little girl, hearing a story about a little girl who's going to go on a pirate adventure, right? She relates to that story. But in, say, a B2B context, it can also be relating to the person in a case study that you're writing about, a company that's similar to yours, right? This doesn't always have to be fantastic fictional storytelling. It can be stories about the people we're trying to reach. Highly immersive stories have an element of novelty. So our brains are programmed to respond to things that are new. Our brains light up when we hear something new. And so we're not going to respond to the same article, the same thoughts that we've heard time and time again. Instead, we're going to respond to a new thought, a new idea, a new story that we haven't heard before. Fluency is incredibly important. Often as marketers and content marketers, we can conflate authority with complexity. So, we want people to think that we're smart. Let's produce this white paper that's really hard to read, that uses very technical language, and people will think are smart. What's actually much harder to do is to take complex concepts and have it so they read at a 6th, 7th grade level, because most US consumers cannot read at a high school grade level. 52% read an 8th grade level or below. So if we want people to actually engage with our stories, we need to make it as easy as possible, as fluent as possible. The same thing with video. Resist the temptation of putting your 50-year-old CEO on video just droning on in an interview for 35 minutes. No one wants to watch that. It's not fluent. It's not easy for people to engage with. Instead, tell stories that are quick, that have quick cuts, that have autoplay captions within the first 3 seconds, action, voiceover. These are the things that make for highly fluent stories. And the last is tension. So Aristotle once said that the key to a good story is establishing the gap between what is and what could be. And think about any of your favorite movies that you've seen, any great rom-com, right? Any great rom-com, I'm a sucker for rom-coms, is about this gap between what is and what could be. The guy is pining after the girl, and he tries to win her over, and he starts to make some progress, but then the awful ex-boyfriend swoops in, right? And that gap opens again. But then he starts to win her over, but then he goes to one of the family functions, and he totally messes up. He spills himself into the wedding cake. He gets too drunk. That gap opens again. And then finally, he has to work to win her over, and that's the resolution, the bliss at the end of the movie. All great stories follow this pattern. Action movies, Ocean's 11, right? George Clooney is trying to rob the casino with his band of merry friends. They start to progress in their plan, but then something goes wrong. They start to progress in their plan, and something goes wrong. We need to maintain this tension between what is and what could be. In B2B storytelling, this could be simply talking about the gap between the state of what's happening in your industry and the greater desired state you can get to. For our brand at Contently, it's about what's the reality of content marketing is today, what are the challenges we're running into, and where is that better place that we can get to. That's what keeps people interested.